Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah and Amy. We're so excited to be able to collaborate with the Sine Institute. I am an alum of American University, a grad school alum. Didn't get my undergrad here, but was at the School of Public Affairs and actually was one of Molly's former students. So was on the campaign trail with her in 2016 when this crazy road we find ourselves on really started. So it's great to be with you and Doug. Thank you so much for joining us today. Molly, I want to start with you and really dive into some of the polling. When was the survey done and who was interviewed? Just want to get some of those details.
Sure. So thanks, everyone. Is this working? Great. Okay. I'm thrilled to be here for the third annual Sine release of the poll, the first one happening in a presidential year. And so I think our focus this year on how young Americans see and view political leadership is especially fitting. And to answer your question, the survey was over 1,200 interviews, so a robust sample online of 18 to 34-year-olds, and regardless of registration status. So we had both registered and unregistered respondents, and we did oversamples of Black, Hispanic, and LGBTQ plus respondents because we wanted to be able to report out results for them. And I think what's unique about this survey is that we really tried to go beyond diagnosing a problem that we know is there, that people are disappointed and frustrated with political leadership in this country. Young Americans are no exception. They may have a distinct point of view, but we wanted to do more than just document or reinforce that. We really wanted to move to the next stage of trying to come up with some prescriptions or some cures. What would the fix look like?
Doug, we are inundated with polls, those of us that work in politics and in media. We get so many of them. So, and particularly recently on young voters, we know that, 40 million members of Gen Z will be eligible to vote in November. So they're a big voting bloc. But talk about how this poll is different and tell us about the top 4 leadership styles that these young Americans are looking for.
Yeah, I was excited to take part in it, partly because my passion in this work is bringing insights from the social sciences to help us understand how to communicate with people, how do people understand things, what motivates them, et cetera. And Molly did some very cool methodological innovations in this, which she can talk about more. But this piece of it was getting beyond looking at policy agendas and resumes to what kind of leaders are young people looking for. And the inspiration from that came from decades of research in political science, which started on what do people look for in presidents. And what the research found was, like, when we're sizing up a leader, and that has since been applied to leaders of all kinds, and even brands, like of organizations. We're not like looking at their resume, or like when people watch a debate, most people aren't sitting there doing a checklist on who won the debate and do I agree on everything. They're sizing them up as people. And it's interesting, those insights were developed into sort of a framework for how do you win trust? How do leaders win trust? So it turns out when we're looking at leaders, or kind of anybody, the sort of our subconscious, the way we judge whether it's somebody coming into our view, we do 2 things. We quickly assess, often subconsciously, do they mean me well or ill? And are they capable of doing me well or ill? This is like our survival toolkit. And so do I trust this person who's coming to my view? So the research has fleshed out a number of dimensions, which they call strength and warmth. Competence in leadership meets empathy and integrity. So we can explore, so that's what we did. Well, what are young people looking for when you look at that sort of basket of leadership traits? What kind of leader? And the student advisors came up with their own that they put in the mix, which is exactly how you want to do this kind of research. And we tested 8 different traits, and 4 rose to the top: integrity, authenticity, inclusivity, and compassion. So I'll stop there. We can talk more about those, but that was one of the cool innovations of this.
I'll just add, in terms of the methodology, what we did is, with our student advisors, developed kind of mock scripts that a hypothetical candidate might make in appealing to voters. And each of those scripts emphasized a different leadership quality or trait, like Doug just described. And then we asked our respondents, because we know young people like to interact with surveys in a way that they're not just responding to kind of batteries and issue lists, but to really make this interactive as part of our effort to come up with a prescription or a solution. So to listen and then to rate and interact with these audio clips, we used an AI generated voice so that it was gender neutral, because I've done a lot of research to know that there are important gender differences when candidates make different pitches. So that was one of an example of one of the unique methodologies that we brought into this poll to, again, try and kind of get us beyond just, okay, here's the problem, but what are some of the solutions?
I think one stat from the poll that really stuck out to me was 83% of young voters said they were worried about the state of democracy. That's a pretty bleak number. How does this impact, and I want to get both of your takes on this, how does that impact voter enthusiasm? Does it drive these young voters to go out and make a difference, whether they're Republican or Democrat, and really get involved in politics, policymaking, or does it make them feel that they should stay at home, more pessimistic?
I'll just jump in and say, I think that in part that's the challenge of both campaigns, right, is that there is this anxiety about kind of what's going on with the country. Another interesting finding is that there's a really significant gap when we ask young Americans how they feel about their own future for themselves personally. It's pretty high. But when we ask them how they feel about the future for the country, it's dramatically like 30-point gap difference. And so that anxiety and nervousness can translate a lot of ways. And what we're, I think going to be seeing in the next 6 weeks is really an attempt to harness that momentum and that energy among young Americans and get them out to the polls.
Right.
I think this trust framework gives you a way to assess this. One angle on democracy is, do I trust the democratic institutions? Is my vote going to be counted? Does it matter even if it is? Are the institutions going to respond to me? That's I think one of the cool things about this. There's insights in there for leaders and organizations of all kinds, including people who are in elective office, to instill confidence and earn people's trust, which goes beyond cool messages. You actually have to walk the talk.
I think you hear both campaigns, just looking at the presidential level, the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign, obviously talk about democracy, but with the Harris campaign in particular, they have made democracy and protecting democracy very central to their messaging. Do you have any insight as to how voters are responding to that messaging, if that's really, or young voters, I should say, and if that's making a difference with them?
One of the things we know from, we did sort of start off the survey. And actually, it would be great if we could pull up one of the slides, slide 1, if possible, that we know that one of the chief complaints is that young Americans feel like elected leaders and candidates aren't listening to them. And so anytime you can kind of have a dialogue that is more responsive to what young people say are not somebody else's agenda, but really their agenda, and doing active listening. I think that was one of the distinctive things that young Americans are looking for in their leaders. And also, we asked about a series of things that candidates could do to demonstrate really kind of strategic or tactical things that candidates could do to say and prove that they're actively listening and experiencing these things. Having, for example, like a youth advisory panel, going out in the community and working side by side with constituents, not addressing them kind of top down, but being part of the community. Those kinds of things that really emphasize being part of an experience and listening and interacting, those were really impressive for young people.
Yeah, that reflects research we did with the Partnership for Public Service, a great organization for those who don't know it. It was support public servants. And we did focus groups with people to test like stories and examples of government working. And the trust was so low, it was like, what's the analogy? Anyway, we had to it took like 90 minutes of people hearing actual factual stories and we were doing it on Congress. And one of the most important things to reflect what Molly was just saying, when people heard examples of elected officials actually listening and responding, trying to get something done, that was one of the biggest drivers of trust.
Molly, you brought up an interesting point talking about youth advisory boards, getting into the communities, meeting these voters where they are. And it's interesting, ever since we saw Harris become the presumptive Democratic nominee, there's been, and you see this on the right as well, I'm just going to use her as an example, there's been this groundswell of online energy, whether it was, Brat Girl Summer, Swifties for Kamala. I mean, the endorsement from Taylor Swift itself, there's been a lot of questions as to, how does this play, into the campaign? Can Taylor Swift use her, very unique, massive reach to, reach some of these voters? But that, I don't want to call it noise from online, but that energy online, I mean, are we reading too much into it? Is it more, should campaigns be paying more attention to reaching young voters online where they can reach a massive number of voters, or do they need to put in the time and effort to go into the communities in person?
Well, I think it's ideally it's both.
Both, yeah.
But I think the Harrison Walz campaign has been credited, I think rightly so, for demonstrating or generating that momentum by, for example, when Harris became the nominee, and part of her opening week was listening and understanding, I want to be a president who helps Americans achieve their American dream. And then she's kind of developed an agenda around housing and other things. And also Harris, just as a high school teacher who is used to being able to kind of interact and have conversations in a very authentic, natural setting. I think those things have been really exciting for young Americans to see traits that they don't typically see certainly in presidential and vice presidential candidates.
Doug, one fascinating thing I've learned talking to Gen Z voters, I'm a millennial, so it's great to get their perspective, but they're not as interested in the figurehead or the person. So it's not, from what I've gathered, it's not necessarily the politician. They want to hear that this person is supportive of the issues they care about, whether it's the environment, LGBTQ plus issues, the economy, et cetera. Do you get that? What are the issues that, from what you found in this research, young voters are most passionate about?
I want to speak to the traits and let Molly speak to the issues. She's more on the traits. I mentioned integrity, authenticity, inclusivity, and compassion. And the method was, what's important to you? And then we asked about the candidates. And Harris she was winning all of those. So they were seeing a kind of leader. That's what this says. They are seeing a kind of leader there that gives them a lot of confidence. And I think where the trick in these things is, stated voting intention of poll does not necessarily translate into going out and voting is the biggest, right? That's the biggest thing. Back to your question, like you have to engage with people in a real way to get them to vote. And the survey went into that. What were some of the obstacles?
Yeah, I would just add that the issue agenda that young people are voting on isn't actually all that different than it is for older Americans. This is an election that is very much about the economy, cost of living, and feeling as though you're going to be able to afford and grow into even modest goals of being able to own a house someday, being able to have a stable career, not have your health care depend on your job or feeling stuck in a job, eventually being able to have childcare and raise a family.
Absolutely. One issue I want to touch on, and this was an issue that many students and faculty on college campuses dealt with quite a bit during the spring, was the reaction to the Israel-Hamas war. A lot of news coverage about the U.S. response to that war and how it's played with Palestinian Americans, with Israeli Americans, Jewish American students. But I thought the finding from the poll was fascinating. 35% said they were aligned with caring about Israel and Gaza, but only 18% said they took action. I just, as someone who's covered the political response to this, I guess I would have expected that to be a larger number. I just wanted to get your take on this. Was this something that, I don't want to say was over exaggerated by the news media and politicians, but how is this really played among young voters?
Well, I don't want to minimize at all the energy around that issue, but it is with a very specific audience of young Americans. And so, yes, a lot of that was taking place on college campuses, and so it was very visible. And credit to those young people who were speaking out on that. They were extremely smart about being able to, be media savvy and get attention. And so it's not to minimize that at all, but I think you're right that we should put it in perspective, that is not the dominant issue for most young Americans. They are really very much about kind of their daily lives and the support and resources they need to help make their daily lives just a little bit easier.
And you said about 18% said they took some kind of action.
Yes.
Between 10 and 20 is about what you're going to see people actually taking action on issues they care about. So people will care about a lot of issues, but we have limited energy and knowledge about how to take action and that sort of thing. So you often, or it's the data on social media activity too. It's about 2% of the people create almost all the content on social media. About 10% are sharing it, and everybody else pretty much observing. That is a decent rule of thumb to think of, like, so 18%, that's a lot of action. But that's another area where I think there's a lot of work to be done to build trust and confidence with young people, is education and engagement to show people how to get involved in things in constructive ways, which can include protest. Right. And lots of other things that you can do.
Right. We only have a few minutes left, but I have to ask this because I covered Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. What did you get from the findings in terms of how young voters are looking at those two candidates? I know that Harris obviously leads, but, particularly when there were third-party candidates in play, her lead was smaller. Do you think, and I know that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is trying to get off the ballot so he can, be on Trump's team. But you still have Cornel West, Jill Stein. A lot of people would argue that Jill Stein could have played a major role in Michigan, for example, in 2016. How are young people viewing these third-party candidates?
Well, I think I'll fill that in two ways. At the time of the poll, Harris had just ascended to the top of the ticket. And so there was still a and I think in fairness still is, a steep learning curve that's going on. We've had the convention since then, the debate, so some of those information gaps have been filled in. But when at the time of the poll and still today in polling that's publicly available, Harris has a double-digit advantage over Trump among voters 18 to 34. But I think what's really interesting in that, in our findings, is that we asked early on, before we even talked about the presidential election, what are the traits you most value in a leader? And then once they prioritized or rank ordered them, then we talked a little bit about the presidential race. We had them go back and rank order who was better on each of those issues that they prioritized. And Harris had a pretty substantive lead over Trump, so that this is not just kind of, she kind of had a good rollout, or we think she's really killing it on social media. They really see kind of substantive things that Harris stands for, that they care about and prioritize.
Yeah, and it was on all 8 traits.
Yes.
She was well ahead on all 8. And interestingly, those who said they saw those traits in her were more likely to vote than the ones who were rating Trump highly. So there's a little bit of Harris advantage on voting intent there. Again, you got to do the work to turn intent into action. But I was like, oh, wow, she's got a little advantage there on stated intent to turn out.
Interesting, and we'll be watching as we get closer to November if these, the poll numbers across the board, the young voters just in general, I'm assuming it's going to get more narrow, so we'll be looking out for it. Molly and Doug, thank you so much for your work on this poll, for joining me on stage. Thank you so much to the Youth Advisory Board as well. I mean, that's just such hard work as students, so I really want to commend you guys for that.